everyone. Hope you've had a good day. Welcome back to your bedtime story about Krindlekrax. Shall we find out what Ruskin's been up to? Chapter 17. It was getting dark outside. Clutching the medal tightly, Ruskin walked down Lizard Street towards his home. He looked at the cracks in the pavement and the holes in the road and the dark bricks and imagined Krindlekrax walking up and down Lizard Street, its huge tail cracking, its sharp claws digging, its hot breath scorching, looking for Corky Pigeon. He imagined Krindlekrax looking in through windows, peeping through curtains, watching people sleep and dream. Perhaps Krindlekrax had even seen him, Ruskin Splinter, curled up in his bed, and wondered who this small, thin, red-haired boy was, sleeping contentedly in a room full of actors' photographs. Ruskin stood on the large drain in front of his house. The metal drain cover wobbled from side to side. Ker-clunk went the drain cover. Ruskin thought, this is the largest drain in Lizard Street. It's from this drain that Krindlekrax rises when he's searching for Corky. Ruskin got to his knees and put his ear to the cold metal. He listened as hard as he could. For a while he heard nothing, and then he heard it. A distant rumbling. The drain started to vibrate. The rumbling got louder and louder, so loud Ruskin's knees started to tremble. It was Krindlekrax, down there in the sewer. It was stomping through endless corridors of water, through chambers as large as cathedrals and waterfalls as high as mountains. Ruskin got to his feet, brushed the dust from his knees, then looked up at his house. He noticed the window Elvis had smashed that morning had been covered now with a sheet of newspaper. Nearly all the windows were paper instead of glass now. Ruskin went inside. His mum and dad were sitting at the kitchen table eating baked beans on toast. His dad, Winston, was still in his pyjama bottoms and a white vest with holes in. The front of the vest was thick with baked bean and marmalade and egg stains. Kiss, Wendy said. Ruskin kissed her cheek. Tea? She asked. Yes, please, replied Ruskin. Beans on toast? Yes, please. Every evening Wendy said kiss, followed by tea, then beans on toast, or poached egg, or scrambled egg, or fried egg. And every evening Ruskin kissed her cheek and said, yes please, to both questions. Ruskin sat at the table. Winston's eyes were glued to the television set in the corner of the room. Someone on the screen was talking about the weather. It's the hottest summer ever. Lawns are turning brown, flowers are drying up, and we're running out of water. Ruskin said, I wish we didn't have newspaper at our windows. We can't afford to keep replacing the windows, Winston said, still staring at the television. Now, the worst thing Elvis can do is rip paper instead of smashing glass. But it looks silly, Dad. It's not my fault. Oh, polly-wolly doodle all the day, Wendy said, handing Ruskin some tea and putting some bread in the toaster. Don't make such a fuss. You should get Elvis's dad to pay for it, Ruskin remarked. Why don't you go and speak to him? Oh, I don't want to speak to Elvis's dad, Winston insisted. Not now, or ever. Besides, don't forget my motto. Don't interfere. Wendy poured Ruskin a cup of tea and asked, did you get the part of the hero in the school play? No, Ruskin replied. I said you wouldn't, Wendy said. Fancy thinking a small, thin, red-haired boy like you with a squeaky whisper of a voice could pass for a handsome, tall, muscular, thunderous-voiced hero. The toast popped out of the toaster. Wendy buttered it, poured some baked beans on top and handed it to Ruskin. We have toast with everything, Ruskin said. I love toast, Wendy said ecstatically. But we can't eat all of it, Ruskin said, looking at his meal. I mean, what happens to the toast leftovers? I throw it away, Wendy said, staring at the television set. The person on the television was saying, paint is peeling, walls are cracking, people are getting sunstroke, drains are smelling. Ruskin asked, where do you throw all the toast? Down the drain, of course, Wendy replied. Ruskin looked at his mum. The light from the television set reflected in her eyes, making them look like car headlights. "Have you always thrown our uneaten toast down the drain?" he asked. "Always," Wendy replied. "The drain outside?" "Of course," Wendy said. "After all, it's the biggest drain in Lizard Street." Ruskin ate the rest of his meal in silence. Afterwards he went up to his room and sat by the window. Now he knew why the baby crocodile had grown so big. Corky said that it had been eating toast when he first saw it. And that's what it had continued to do. For 10 years. A daily diet of toast and butter, toast and marmalade, toast and baked beans, toast and poached egg, or scrambled egg, or fried egg, and the toast had made the crocodile big and strong, had given it a tail and sharp claws and fiery breath, had transformed it from a tiny, bright green baby, no bigger than a shoe, into a gigantic, dark monster that drained the colour from Corky's hair and nightly damaged Lizard Street. "I'm going to sit here all night," Ruskin said, looking out of the window. "I'm going to stay awake and wait for Krindlekrax." Ruskin stared down the length of Lizard Street. One by one, the lights in windows, well, what windows were still unsmashed by Elvis's ball, went out and people went to bed. Ruskin knew the street so well. He looked at Mr. Lacey's house with its window box full of marigolds. He looked at Dr. Flowers' house, from where came the sound of the hay-fevered doctor sneezing in his sleep. "Tissue! Tissue! Tissue!" He looked at Sparky Walnut's house, where no doubt Mrs. Walnut hoped her shop window would not be broken again by a sleepwalking Elvis. He looked at Corky's house, where Corky was tucked up tightly, his windows locked, doors bolted, protecting himself from Krindlekrax. He looked at the pub, the Dragon and the Golden Penny, where Mr. and Mrs. Cave smoked endless cigars and Elvis lay in his bed, his ball cradled in his arm. And he looked at the school, at the other end of the street. The school, with its turrets and railings, was like a gigantic castle against the moonlit, star-filled sky. Ruskin took the medal from his pocket. There was a pin attached to the medal, so it could be pinned on the owner. The medal gleamed in the moonlight. The light reflected in Ruskin's eyes and made him feel tired. Ruskin closed his eyes for a while. He must have fallen asleep, because suddenly he heard a noise and jumped up. At first he thought it was Krindlekrax. Then he realised it wasn't. Da-boing went the noise. It was Elvis's football. Ruskin peered down Lizard Street. There, at the other end, Elvis was sleepwalking and bouncing the ball. Even though Elvis was in his pyjamas, he still wore his American football helmet, and the shoulders to his pyjamas were padded. The moonlight made Elvis's shadow very long. It ran down the whole length of Lizard Street. Da-boing went the ball. It was the only sound in Lizard Street, and it echoed from building to building. "What a nasty boy you are," thought Ruskin, watching Elvis. "You grow 3 times as big and steal my ball, and you smash all our windows." Suddenly, the ball struck a bump in the road and bounced off at an angle. The ball hit Mr. Lacey's window. Smash went the window. One by one, the windows of Lizard Street lit up as people struggled out of bed. The first on the street was Mr. Lace. Although he was wearing a long white neck shirt, he still had his scarf round his neck and pencils in his hair. There was a pencil in his mouth as well, confirming the rumour that Mr. Lace sucked a pencil in his sleep like babies suck a dummy. "My window!" cried Mr. Lace, waving his hands in the air. Then he looked at the window boxes. A few of the marigolds had been damaged by the ball. "My flowers!" Mr. Lace cried. "My beautiful flowers!" Other people were in the street now. Mr. Flick in his emerald green dressing gown with a velvet collar. Mrs. Walnut in an olive green potato-smelling dressing gown. Mr. and Mrs. Cave still smoking cigars. Dr. Flowers with paper handkerchiefs stuck to his face. They all stood round Mr. Lace and tried to comfort him as he bemoaned the state of his window boxes. "It's terrible," said Mr. Flick. "Outrageous," said Mrs. Walnut. "Disgraceful," said Dr. Flowers. "Choo!" "You're lucky," Mrs. Walnut said. "He's broken my shop window 6 times now." "And my window 7 times, said Mr. Flick. Ruskin's mum and dad were peering from behind the front door. "He keeps breaking our windows too," called Wendy. "Shh," said Winston, closing the door. "Don't interfere." Mr. Cave put his arms round Elvis and said, "Oh, look how innocent he is. He doesn't even know what he's doing." "My poor little Elfie baby," said Mrs. Cave. Everyone in the street stared at Elvis. "Now then," Mr. Cave said, "give him his ball back, otherwise he'll be upset in the morning, and you wouldn't want that to happen. You know how many windows Elvis smashes when he gets upset." Mr. Lace bit a pencil in half and went inside to get Elvis's ball. "It's terrible," sighed Mr. Flick. "Outrageous!" gasped Mrs. Walnut. "Disgraceful!" exclaimed Dr. Flowers. "Chew!" Mr. Lace returned with the ball and gave it to Elvis. As soon as it was in Elvis's hands, he started to bounce it. Da-boing! Mr. and Mrs. Cave led Elvis back to the pub and locked the door. The people of Lizard Street looked at each other in silence for a while. Then they shrugged their shoulders, sighed, and went to bed. All except Mr. Lace, that is. He got a broom and started sweeping up the broken glass. Corky came out of his house and helped Mr. Lace sweep the glass into a bin bag. "He's a nuisance, that boy," Mr. Lace said, wiping tears from his eyes. "Even in his sleep he scares us," said Corky. Once all the glass was swept away, Mr. Lace went into his house and locked the door. Corky stood alone in the street for a while. He glanced up and saw Ruskin sitting in his window. Corky waved his stick in the air. Ruskin waved back. Corky went inside and locked his door. Ruskin sat for a while waiting for Krindlekrax, but gradually weariness overcame him, and he knew he had to go to bed. He changed into his pyjamas, green and white striped, looked at the golden medal, then closed the window. "Good night, Lizard Street," he said.